Good afternoon, or evening, since we've changed the clocks, and welcome to the Library of Congress. I am Kenneth Nirati, head of the European Reading Room at the library. We're pleased that you can join us to hear our guest speaker, Andrew Nagorski, discuss his latest book, 1941, The Year Germany Lost the War. My colleague, Grant Harris, chief of the European Division, will serve as session moderator. There will be time after the session for questions and answers, and that'll be followed by a book signing. Very briefly, let me say that the library has some of the largest collections of materials from and about the countries of Europe, outside those countries, including publications concerning World War II. The European collections are particularly strong in history, language, literature, and the social sciences, whether in English or in foreign languages. You may want to pick up the European Division flyer and bookmarks, which are on a table in the back, that describe our collections and services. Some of you may not know that the Library of Congress reading rooms are open to the public, and we encourage you to come back as readers or researchers. If you haven't seen our display of items in the back of the room, please take a look after the presentation. It concerns publications by and about several of the governments and emigre groups in London in exile during World War II, a topic that Mr. Nagorski describes in his book. Just necessary, please turn off your cell phones and other electronic devices for the duration of the program. And also be aware that the event is being recorded for a future Library of Congress webcast. When we have the question and answer period, please understand that if you ask a question, you are consenting to be part of the webcast. We hope that you enjoy this talk and that you'll come again to explore the library's collections. Now, please help me welcome both the author, Andrew Nagorski, and the chief of the European Division, Grant Harris.
Well, let me read just a few things about Andrew Nagorski. I could read a lot more than this, but I need to keep it short. So Andrew Nagorski is an American journalist and author who spent more than 3 decades as a foreign correspondent and editor for Newsweek. He served as foreign correspondent in Moscow, Berlin, Bonn, Rome, Warsaw, and even Hong Kong. He is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and has published several times in its prestigious journal, Foreign Affairs. Mr. Nagorski has written several award-winning books relating to Germany, Poland, Russia, and Eastern Europe. He has written most extensively on Germany, Hitler, and World War II. His newest book, 1941, The Year Germany Lost the War, has received favorable reviews. One reviewer has said this: thanks to his mastery of historical sources and his acute insight into when, why, and how decisions are made in real life, he is able to make a credible argument that 1941 was a turning point. So now I turn to you finally, and I've got a number of questions for you. The book is all about 1941. But I want you to set the stage for us. What happened before that? Germany was on the march all over, north and south. Set the stage for us. What happened before then?
I would say, if you look at 1941, the end of 1940, beginning of 1941, you've gone through this period where I think Hitler and his Germany, his Third Reich, has been underestimated for years. First, Hitler himself was underestimated when he was rising to power for all sorts of reasons. That's a longer topic but people, whether it's foreign observers, German politicians, even some German Jewish leaders who felt this man can't be a serious leader. He cannot become the leader of Germany, or if he is, he's somebody who we will be able to control and will not do these crazy things he's saying he's going to do. But then he takes power, as we know, in 1933, and by 1938 is embarked on this, he's not only consolidated his power at home and eliminated any potential rivals and begun things like the attacks on Jews on Kristallnacht. But he has begun a course which seems to be a collision course with just about everybody else. And that, of course, means the Anschluss of Austria, he takes over Austria, he challenges Britain and France over Czechoslovakia, and famous appeasement, and he dismembers Czechoslovakia. And then, of course, September 1, 1939, he attacks Poland, which is the beginning of World War II. And there's a feeling all along, there have been people, not just in the West, but also within Germany, within the German army, within the economic offices and so forth, who are saying, basically, Herr Hitler, be careful. You're taking on an awful lot, and Germany isn't as prepared as you think, and doesn't have the resources to take on everyone. And yet, every time that he makes another move, everybody else retreats. And so he takes over Poland, and significantly, to do that, he makes his pact with Stalin, with the Soviet Union, the Nazi-Soviet pact. So that neutralizes Russia. In fact, it more than neutralizes Russia. The Soviet Union, Stalin's Soviet Union, becomes a major supplier of Nazi Germany in this period. So he's got them off this side. The U.S. is still out of the war, of course. There's a lot of isolationist sentiment. Roosevelt is sympathetic to the British, but he's not about to buck that sentiment. And then he turns on the West. He attacks Norway, Denmark, the Benelux countries, and ultimately France, which is, of course, the real revenge for World War I. And everything seems to be going his way. And by the beginning of 41, his planes, they have not, the German Luftwaffe, the Air Force, was unable to knock out the Royal Air Force in the Battle of Britain, but they're bombing British cities, and it looks Britain is under attack. And even many of his generals who had thought, this is sort of crazy, we're taking on all these countries, begin to feel this man has an infallible instinct. Maybe we were all wrong and he was right, and Germany is going to win the war.
Thank you for that background. Well, one of the things I like about your book is that you get into the minds of many of these characters. You really tell a lot. And so you actually start with January 1st of 1941. You start with a diary entry by Yvonne Myski, who is the Soviet ambassador to Great Britain. So what did he write in his diary on that day, January 1st?
Myski's an interesting character. He'd been in Britain as the ambassador since, I think, 33 or so. He was very friendly with many top-level British officials, but he was, of course, Stalin's representative, and there is this odd thing where Myski is smart enough to realize Germany is overextending itself, and he writes in his diary on that day, said, 41 is going to be the critical year because Germany, in order to win this war, has to win it quickly, because once he's assuming the U.S. is going to get increasingly supportive of Britain, which means the industrial might of the U.S. So he said, and Britain will begin to really gin up its war industry. Once the Anglo-Saxon countries have all the capacity, then in a prolonged war, Germany is not going to be able to win. And which is, by the way, what some of the German planners had been telling Hitler too. So he says Hitler has to do something to win this war quickly. So what does Myski speculate? He says, okay, now Hitler's really going to attack Britain to make sure Britain is defeated, and that's going to be that big move in 41, even though his German bombers were already attacking Britain, but they had not been able to attack and mount an amphibious invasion. Of course, looming in the background is another possibility, which Myski does not care to mention. Will Hitler honor his pact with Stalin and what will happen with the Soviet Union. But that goes to show that even someone like Myski, who was quite a smart individual, but even in his own diary, he didn't dare to question Stalin's judgment, which was Hitler is going to honor this pact at least long enough for us to be able to rebuild after our own setbacks. They had fought the war in Finland and not done so well. Stalin had purged the Soviet military. And so Myski doesn't even mention that possibility. So he's right about 1941 being the critical year. He's wrong about why it's going to be the critical year.
You've done research on Germany, the countries around it, several books, and I hear you keep on the same subject, Germany, World War II, and I appreciate that. I like that a lot. Did you learn anything new, or was this just all things you already had left over from other books, or were there some surprises as you did more research?
There are always surprises when you do more research. One, before I start with Germany and Russia, I mean, for me, this book, since it involved a central character, of course, is Churchill, and then the U.S.-British relationship, which is the other thread going. There's a reason why on the cover of the book you've got Hitler, Stalin, Churchill, and FDR. One of the things that struck me was about Churchill. Of course, he became prime minister in 1940 in May when France was collapsing. And as many of you know, of course, Churchill had been in what was considered the political wilderness. He was in he was seen as someone whose time was past in many ways. But the one thing he got right was the threat of Hitler and the Nazis. And as a result, when the appeasement policy completely collapsed, they turned to Churchill. Now, we all know Churchill as the man who makes the famous speech about we will fight them on the beaches and in the streets, we will never surrender. But one of the things I found in one of these personal recollections, this time of his bodyguard, a Scotland Yard detective, on May the 10th of 1940, when he goes in to see King George, he knows he's going to be asked to form a government. He comes out and he talks to, and he asks his bodyguard, "Do you know why I was summoned to the palace?" And his bodyguard says, "I think I know. I wish you best. I wish that it happened at a better time." And at that moment, Churchill had tears in his eyes. He says, "I do too. I hope it's not too late." That's a different Churchill than the public Churchill, which is always convinced it can't be too late, we're going to win. There were these moments of vulnerability. Another example from a diary from one of Churchill's most fervent supporters, a conservative MP, Harold Nicholson, and he writes about the same time, while he's also going into this thing, why Britain will never surrender, and we have to be victorious. But in private, he's writing, there's a letter from him to his wife, who was a fairly well-known writer at the time, and says, "I'm glad we have those 2 pills, cyanide pills." He says, "If the Germans take Britain, I don't mind dying what he called an honorable death, but I sure don't want to be tortured by these bastards." And this is the extent to which, on that side of that equation, the fear, the sense that things could have gone either way was very extensive. And then from previous work, and I continued it, I mean, the extent to which Moscow was on the verge of collapsing, I managed a few years ago to interview someone whose father had embalmed Lenin, who was one of the original embalmers. And his son in the 30s had gone to medical school and was brought in by his father to become part of the team that maintained that Lenin mummy in the tomb, and then was helped evacuate the body of Lenin, because Stalin knew if Hitler takes Moscow and he seizes Lenin, the symbolism of that is just overwhelming. So, I mean, these are things you don't think, you know the broad sweep of history, but when you learn those kinds of details and actually hear it from the people themselves, some of whom were still around when I started interviewing, it's just fascinating.
It is fascinating. Let me ask you just maybe to continue about Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Here we have Churchill, who desperately needs the United States to be in the war. And yet, Roosevelt is dealing with Charles Lindbergh, others who are not at all for going to war. So tell us something about how the relations between Churchill and Roosevelt developed in the communication.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Churchill and Roosevelt had only met in person once at that point, and that was in either right during World War I or right at the end of World War I, when Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty in charge of the Royal Navy, and Roosevelt, FDR, was the Secretary of the Navy in the U.S. So they had sort of equivalent positions. I think he was maybe Assistant Secretary of the Navy then. And he went on FDR came to London on some sort of delegation, and he was at a reception where he met Churchill. Years later, Churchill was asked about this, and he didn't even remember that he'd met FDR, which did not please FDR. And there was a bit at the distance, this kind of initial standoffishness. FDR tended to see Churchill as this British imperialist who supported, for instance, the empire and was not very sympathetic to Indian independence and so forth. And Churchill saw Roosevelt as this president who he needed him, as you said, but was also sort of very conscious of public opinion in the U.S., the isolationist sentiment, the sense of Americans that got into World War I late in the war, and then had been assured that this would sort of solve the situation. They wouldn't have to go back to Europe, and now pressure was mounting again. And so Churchill was a bit impatient with that, but the two men developed a phenomenally close relationship at a distance at first for a couple reasons. Roosevelt detected early, even before Churchill became prime minister, that he was the one guy who might rise to the top to confront Hitler. And so he initiated a correspondence with him and reminded him, we were both had roles with the Navy, and he signed his letters, I think, Churchill signed the letter in reply for a naval person, and they got that bond going. And interestingly enough, Roosevelt said, you can write to me directly by pouch or telegram. In other words, you can bypass my ambassador in London. He didn't quite say that, but that was the implication. And who was the ambassador in London? Joseph Kennedy. Joseph Kennedy was and who was a very anti-British, and was telling Washington, Britain's going to collapse. They're not going to hold out. Everyone's predicting that after France fell, Britain's next. So it's not even worth supporting Britain. And Churchill knew that and was not exactly thrilled by Kennedy's presence. In 41, eventually, in late 40, Kennedy is withdrawn and eventually replaced by a much more pro-British ambassador. But so they developed this relationship, these contacts, and throughout the war, there something like a huge number, like 900 letters, extensive memos to each other. And Roosevelt sends various envoys, Harriman, Hopkins, others to meet with Churchill, and by proxy, and then in person, first when they signed the Atlantic Charter off the coast of Canada, and then in trips to to Washington. They develop a really magnificent relationship, and especially it starts in 1941 with the battle over Lend-Lease legislation, because Churchill says to Roosevelt, look, I mean, we appreciate the help you're sending us. We're paying for it now. We're not going to be able to pay for it much longer, so what do you do? And that's when the genesis of Lend-Lease, basically, we'll give you the stuff now, you'll pay us somehow later. And Roosevelt, to his credit, what his genius was to put this in terms Americans could understand. And he said, in one of his fireside chats, as he was trying to sell this Lend-Lease legislation to Congress in the beginning of 41, he said, imagine that your neighbor's house is on fire. And he comes running over to you and says, let me grab your garden hose and try to spray, try to put out this fire. He says, you don't, at that point, you tell him, take that hose and try to put out the fire. You don't say, oh, by the way, that garden hose costs $15, pay me the $15 now. And the way they played it politically and the way Churchill realized he was being pushed by his own people to push Roosevelt for more and for more direct involvement. And he said, he kept cautioning them, look, Roosevelt, only Congress can declare war in the United States. Roosevelt is a very political person. He doesn't want to appear to be pushing for war, but he's trying to help us, so we can't push too hard either. But just one other thing about that relationship, because there's so much to tell, but when finally, of course, 1941 ends December 7th with Pearl Harbor, and Churchill tells Roosevelt basically in a phone call, yeah, I hope you don't mind, but obviously I'm elated that we'll be on the same side. And Roosevelt says he completely understands that, and Churchill immediately comes to Washington in December after Pearl Harbor so that they can plan strategy together. And they had met, as I say, on their warships off the coast of Canada before, but here they have a chance to get that personal rapport. And Roosevelt invites Churchill to the White House to stay there on the floor with his own living quarters. So they're on the same floor, and Roosevelt, of course, is he's in his wheelchair. Roosevelt spends a lot of time in his bedroom and in the bathtub, as he was wont to do, dictating memos and letters. Churchill did, yes, yeah. So they spent a lot of time going in each other's bedrooms and just discussing things there. And at one point, Churchill is in the bathtub dictating a memo or a letter or correspondence to his secretary, a male secretary, I should say. And at a certain point, he gets up out of the bath, puts a big bath towel over himself, and walks into his bedroom and continues dictating. And as he's dictating, that big bath towel falls to the ground at a certain moment. And at that moment, Roosevelt comes into the room on his wheelchair. And without missing a beat, Churchill says to him, you see, Mr. President, I have nothing to conceal from you. So they developed a pretty good relationship.
Thank you for that. You know, a lot of books about this period between Germany and the Soviet Union, they leave out this huge, important country in between called Poland, and the developments that are happening there. And there are stages of things that are happening. I'd like you to go into that some, because your book does go into that in some detail.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'd be less inclined to leave that out, because my own father fought in 1939 in the Polish army, and was part of it. So his story, and my grandfather was in the Polish government in exile in London. So this story feels very immediate to me, and of course what happened in Poland is very immediate. And I think you can't understand this whole relationship between Stalin and Hitler, and then Churchill and Roosevelt, without the origins of the war in 39 because the price of that Nazi-Soviet pact was basically that Hitler would invade from the west, Hitler's armies, and 17 days later on September 17th, the Red Army invaded from the east, they divided up Poland. That was the beginning of the conquest, and the Soviets also took control of the Baltic states soon thereafter. So Poland had a central role in this, and it was also what prompted, I mean, the British and the French had pledged to go to war as opposed to, in the case of Czechoslovakia, if Hitler invaded Poland. And Hitler believed, I think, that they really didn't mean it for a long time. He was sitting there waiting for Ribbentrop, his foreign minister, when the Brits and the French gave an ultimatum saying, you either withdraw or we're going to go to war. He was expecting them to withdraw, and when he was told they've declared war, he was quite taken aback, although for quite a while, that declaration of war didn't have a lot of practical impact. It wasn't as if they were about to march in to fight the Germans in Poland. So Poland has a central role. It has a central role as also the testing ground for Hitler's armies in many ways, because that's the one big battle that lasts about a month. It doesn't sound like a lot, but compared to everybody else who had capitulated very quickly, there was intense fighting. It became the testing ground, the first testing grounds for groups like what were called the Einsatzgruppen, the special killing squads that Hitler's army sent in to kill. In the beginning, it was Jews, intellectuals, nobility, religious leaders. It wasn't only focused on Jews, although it became, by the time it gets to the Soviet Union, it's focused primarily on Jews. Of course, Auschwitz is in what territory annexed from Poland, and it's first a POW for Polish political prisoners, then is envisaged for Soviet POWs, and then gets transformed into a central part of the Shoah or the Holocaust. But so Poland is a central part, and just one small, again, reminder of this. At a certain point when I was doing research on the battle for Moscow, I went to to Vyazma, which is this place about 140 miles west of Moscow, where one of the biggest battles took place in 41. And I went there with a group of what were called searchers, these young Russian vets who went there searching for remains of Soviet soldiers, Red Army soldiers, that was still all these decades later. They were still in these woods that had been deserted since those battles, where literally hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were surrounded by the Germans and wiped out. And we went through there, and there were shell cases and pieces of uniform, and sometimes they would find human remains. And at one point, one of these searchers comes up to me, and he's holding 3 hand grenades. He says to me, "These are Polish hand grenades." And I say, "You'll appreciate this, Andrei. You'll appreciate this." And I knew I had a Polish background. I said, "Well, why are these Polish hand grenades?" He said, "Think about it. You know, when Germany invaded Poland from the west and Soviet Union from the east, they grabbed Poland had a fairly large arms industry. They grabbed every bit from their arsenal. They stole everything from the Poles. And in those first battles after Germany invaded the Soviet Union, they were either side could have been using Polish grenades against each other. You know, it's just, again, one of those ironies of history.
You talk about Rudolf Hess, who was Hitler's deputy, and a rather bizarre moment at this time. Rudolf Hess decides he's going to help Hitler by getting into a plane without telling Hitler and flying into Great Britain and parachuting out. Yeah. Just describe what happened.
Yeah. You have to remember, Rudolf Hess had been one of the earliest Nazis. He was with Hitler in the Landsberg prison in 1923-24, after the failed beer hall putsch, when Hitler had tried to launch a putsch in Bavaria. but he had sort of fought, he was considered a high Nazi, but he was I mean, not that many Nazis were not strange characters, but he was more a stranger than others, and he felt kind of pushed aside. And one of the things Hitler had constantly, and Hess knew of this, Albert Speer talked about this, several times Hitler had expressed the view that we should be able to make a deal with Britain. Let us control Europe, and especially the East, which was the Untermenschen, the subhumans, the Slavs, and of course then get rid of the Jews. But while Britain has these colonies abroad and they have the Navy for it. So we should be able to cut a deal like that. And he talked about this even after these two countries were at war, even when his Air Force was conducting the Blitz and bombing London and other cities every day. And Hess got it in his head that he could sort of, as far as I can see, I think he really believed, I can pull off this great coup, get to Britain, negotiate something. And by the way, he knew there's no way Hitler would accept Churchill as a partner because Churchill was too anti-German. So I'll negotiate with the British aristocracy, which he considered pro-fascist. And there were indeed a few pro-fascists there, but and he just got in his plane, flew over, parachuted out in Scotland, and then Churchill gets a phone call from somebody up in Scotland saying, this guy Rudolf Hess, he seems to be really that Rudolf Hess, has parachuted, and he said, and what do we do with him? And of course, Hitler was furious. He was convinced that the British would make great propaganda hay out of this. But Churchill decided, let's just imprison him, treat him, he's a potential war criminal. In fact, he was later tried in Nuremberg and sentenced to life imprisonment and was the oldest living surviving prisoner until he hanged himself in, I think, 1987 in Spandau prison in Berlin, where he was the only prisoner, and he was already, I think, close to 90, and he managed to hang himself despite a four country guards, 4 power guards. So, but it's one of these things where, in the end, it probably didn't mean that much, but it showed how much this idea, this bizarre idea that Hitler thought that we can find some Brits who are going to basically sell the country out, sell Churchill and his cronies out, and then we'll have them as kind of subservient and get the war over with that way.
Let me ask you about the journalists, the American journalists that were in Great Britain at that time. There were quite a number who were pro-Britain. Yeah. And reporting back to their American newspapers or magazines. One of them was named Dorothy Thompson. I choose her because we've got a woman here, and just tell us a little bit about her background and what she was able to do.
Dorothy Thompson is a fascinating character. She was probably one of the first real celebrity foreign correspondents in the 20s and the early 30s. She had spent time in Germany, in Vienna. She had been, by the way, also for a while married to Sinclair Lewis. And she famously got Hitler wrong in 1931 when she interviewed him, when he was already coming to look like he had the biggest power, the party, and it looked like he was coming to power. She arranges this interview with him, and then she does a quick book on the subject in which she says, I thought I was going to meet the future leader of Germany, but within 50 seconds I realized I wasn't, because he's such a bizarre man with these crazy eyes which are characteristics of hysterics and alcoholics. But to her credit, once Hitler takes power, she goes back to Germany. She's really on the warpath to warn the world, and particularly American readers, that this new man in power in Germany is a threat not just to Germany and to Europe, but to the whole world. And she gets on this crusade, and then in 1941, she actually, she's a very well-known columnist by then. She's syndicated all over the country. She becomes a real cheerleader for passing the Lend-Lease legislation. She even writes the introduction to a booklet issued here in Washington by the U.S. government with the statements by the major figures in the Roosevelt administration, the Secretary of War, the Secretary of State, and so forth, why we should support Britain. And then she goes to Britain, is treated like royalty there. She meets everybody, Churchill and company, and she makes radio broadcasts. She also broadcasts from the BBC, not only within Britain, but she makes a special broadcast back to Germany in German. She did speak German. She had learned German in her time in Europe, and saying, I love the German people, I hate your regime, I want your country to lose this war because it deserves to lose this war. So it's an interesting case study of someone who, put all notion of journalistic objectivity, detachment aside, and said, this is a time when this is a cause, and I am going to do everything to promote this cause.
Let's talk about Stalin. Stalin was getting intelligence from all sides that Germany was about to attack and just didn't want to hear about it.
Right.
So talk about that some and the days right after that and
right.
the weeks after that.
Well, the thing is, you look at these two dictators, and sometimes I say it's almost as if they had achieved incredible power. Of course, they shared this ruthlessness, this willingness to kill, terrorize on a scale that was almost incomprehensible. And they were at the pinnacle of their careers. And yet, it was almost, I'd like to say, in 1941, it's almost like they're having a competition who could be the most stupid dictator. Because here's Stalin, he's getting all these warnings. Hitler's not going to observe the terms of this pact. He's getting ready to invade the Soviet Union. But Stalin wasn't ready for that. He knew his army was not prepared. And he believed genuinely that he could maintain this de facto alliance with Hitler, at least for another year or so. And so he doesn't want to hear the bad news. And anybody who delivers that bad news is in trouble. So even on the eve of the invasion, when there are 3 million German troops amassed on the Soviet border, you think that's a pretty clear sign something's going to happen. And a couple of German defectors cross over to the Soviet side, and their warnings that they're about to invade go all the way up to the Kremlin. What's Stalin's reaction? Execute those guys. It must be disinformation. In his mind, if everybody's telling me this, my own spies, the Western powers, German defectors, it's obviously a plot. I'm being misled. And they want to force us into this conflict when I don't want to be in this conflict. So he is blind to that, and as a result, the Germans' initial offensive really moves very quickly, and his troops are not ready, and they're overrun. While Hitler, on the other hand, is so overconfident about defeating the Soviet Union quickly that he invades in the end of June of 41, which, by the way, is exactly 129 years to the date after Napoleon invaded Russia, and that did not turn out so well. And yet he sends in his troops without winter uniforms because he's convinced they will not need them. They'll win by then. So both have these huge mistakes, but Stalin's paranoia, and Stalin's, when finally the Germans invade, he retreats to his dacha, and the Politburo is looking for him and says, you've got to make an announcement, you've got to do something. And finally, they're waiting for him to come out of the dacha. Finally, they march into the dacha, and there's Stalin sitting there, and he's looking at them. He said, why are you here? And at that point, Mikoyan, one of the Politburo members, said in his recollection, says, "I realized he thought that we were here to arrest him. And in fact, they said, no, we're here to get you to organize an emergency committee, and you'll be the head." And then Stalin realizes he's still in charge. But and by the way, even then, somebody's got to go on the radio to make an announcement to buttress morale and so forth. He says, "No, I'm not going to do it. Let Molotov, the foreign minister, do it." So he doesn't really take charge until a bit later. But it's again shows you how close things were to collapsing.
We'll move on now to December of 1941, the last month of the year. And there were a couple of events. There's December 7, 1941, and I'd ask you to talk about that, and then we'll move on and talk about December 16 in Moscow, Stalin and the British Foreign Secretary. But we'll start with December 7.
Well, of course, throughout 41, there's this whole question, especially among British officials and by many U.S. officials who are very sympathetic to the cause and who feel the U.S. should get directly involved. When is it finally going to happen? And many people are kind of feel that Roosevelt can't quite make up his mind what to do. Then the Japanese hit Pearl Harbor. And what happens? Well, first of all, remember they hit Pearl Harbor, and Roosevelt convenes Congress and asks for a declaration of war on December 8th. But it's a declaration of war against Japan, not Germany. So that's, people tend to forget that. In the immediate aftermath, it's first against, but Churchill felt at this point it was inevitable that, first of all, Japan, Germany, and Italy did have what was called a tripartite pact, so they were supposed to operate together, although their alliance was very shaky. But Roosevelt does not ask for a declaration of war against Germany. And in fact, so what does Hitler do? 3 days later, he declares war on the United States. And it gets basically Roosevelt off the hook. So he's never had to say, I want a war with Hitler. Now, Hitler's reaction to the attack on Pearl Harbor is exactly, it's of a piece of everything else he did that year. Remember why did he invite, he had always envisaged attacking the Soviet Union and taking over the East, but he felt he wasn't ready to do that. So then he attacked Britain, thought he would have Britain capitulate as the one outpost that was still there to oppose his ambitions, and then it would be easy to take over the Soviet Union. Britain does not capitulate. Churchill makes a stand. The Air Force, the Royal Air Force, by the way, with a lot of help from also Polish, Czech, and Commonwealth pilots, staves off the Luftwaffe. So Hitler's next step, he's like an obsessive gambler. Something didn't work. First, he was an obsessive gambler. When things worked, you up the ante. You took Austria, then you take Czechoslovakia, then you attack Poland. When things didn't work, you also up the ante. So when Britain failed to collapse, he decides, okay, now we'll attack the Soviet Union, and then the Soviet Union will be taken over, and then Britain will really collapse, and the US won't get into the war. So when none of that works, he said, okay, now Japan's in the war, we'll declare war on the United States, and Japan in the war is very good news for us. Why? Because Japan has never lost a war, ostensibly, according to Hitler, and that it will tie down the U.S. in the Pacific, and the U.S. will no longer be capable of helping and supplying Britain and the Soviet Union, which it had begun to do under Lend-Lease as well. So he had always the rationale that the next escalation was going to be the one that does it for him. But like his planners said, eventually if you have everybody against you, the odds don't look too good. By the end of 41, and this is why I say it's the year Germany lost the war, Germany is up against Britain, which was the only one they were up against first, then the Soviet Union and the United States. Together, those countries had 3 times the population, 7 times the territory, at least twice the GDP, control of much of the natural resources. And as one of the German historians wrote, said, if you declare war on the whole world, it usually doesn't work out very well.
Let me ask you now about December 16. In Moscow, Stalin had met there with the British Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, and Stalin handed to Anthony Eden a draft treaty for post-war territories, boundaries, and of course it had, Stalin had Poland and the Baltics, other areas going to the Soviet Union.
Or parts of the territory and political control,
Yeah. So we see what happened from there. It happened. What should have happened? What could have made a difference?
It's very interesting that even before that Eden's trip in December, as soon as Germany invaded the Soviet Union, even when it looked like Moscow might fall, Stalin was insisting basically on a post-war order where he would retain everything he had gained in that Nazi-Soviet pact. That means Eastern Poland, control of the Baltic states. And I think there are people who say, and I think a strong argument can be made, there were some people within the US government, people like George Kennan, who had served in Moscow, Lord Ismay, who is the chief military advisor to Churchill, that Churchill and Roosevelt should have taken a stronger stand against Stalin, not allow him to be dictating terms at a time when his own survival was at stake, and especially to basically incorporate all of the gains of a pact with Hitler. But remember one thing, the main fear of Churchill and Roosevelt was that for a long time they were worried that Hitler-Stalin alliance might become permanent and even closer. And by the way, Stalin at one point, even after the war, told his daughter Svetlana at one point something to the effect of, if Hitler and I had stayed together, we would have been invincible. There was sort of, despite their hate, they hated each other on some level, but they also admired each other's ruthlessness, terror, and so forth. And the fact that Stalin had cut a pact with Hitler was always in the minds of the Americans and the British. And there was a fear, even maybe once it was no longer justified, that he might do so again if he gets irritated enough with Churchill and Roosevelt. And he manipulated that and used it very skillfully. And he outmaneuvered them, I think, in many ways. Roosevelt, I think, was much more naive about it. He really believed his assurances that, we'll introduce a democratic system in Poland and other countries where we basically impose the government. Churchill knew that was not the case. And I remember when in July of 1941, after the German invasion, he really pressured the Polish government in exile in London to make a deal with the Russians, since they were ostensibly on the same side. And he said, it was my invidious responsibility to advise the Poles to rely on Soviet good faith. And he knew what that meant. But I think there were ways in which we could have exerted more leverage and been more calculating. But the combination of Roosevelt being willing to give in, he didn't want any preconditions or any quid pro quo on stuff. And Churchill just thinking, his whole idea was, I hate the Soviet system, but we need the Soviets. He made that famous comment when his aide told him, how will you, after the Germans invaded and he was going to go to the House of Commons and declare his support and his alliance with the Soviet Union, he said, don't you feel uncomfortable as someone who's always been an anti-communist? He said, well, if Hitler invaded hell, I'd have a good thing to say for the devil the next day in the House of Commons. And you make the alliances you have to make, but we could have played that alliance better.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I'd like to have some questions and answers. I don't know where the microphones would be to, man is coming with the microphone. So if you have a question, please stand up, raise your hand, and we have one over here.
How credible was the notion that the Duke of Windsor might have become a Nazi puppet on the British throne?
Yes. Well, I think the story of the Duke of Windsor and the Duke of Windsor who visited Germany and with his American wife and all that encouraged those kinds of fantasies of some of the Nazis that the British might depose this man Churchill, who they hated, and there might be a deal to be cut. In fact, when Rudolf Hess parachuted into Scotland, he asked to see some a different British aristocrat. I forget whether he was a duke or someone fairly high up who had visited during the Olympics, the Berlin Olympics in '36, and he had the impression. So he had met him at a reception. The Brit didn't even remember him particularly, but he thought, well, we'll just tell this network and they'll take care of things. So it helped stoke some of those illusions and kept the idea alive that that maybe there's a deal to be made with this part of the British leadership or upper class. And there were also some other very individual cases. As some of you, I'm sure, have heard about the Mitford sisters, Unity Mitford, who went to Germany and became infatuated by Hitler, and he actually was taking this young woman all around and listening. She was 21 years old, and he was listening to her theories about Britain and how eagerly it would become fascist.
Well, thank you very much for being here and for your talk. And it seems to me that you have done research for many, many years on this topic. And I was wondering what some of the best primary sources are. I think you mentioned somewhere in your book that it was the interviews you were able to get with people before they passed on the scene, away from the scene. But if you began your research quite a while ago, I was wondering whether you were able to get into the Soviet archives before they closed again.
Yeah. I think, yes. I mean, as a journalist by training, of course, I love interviews. Yeah, I love also, especially when I could corroborate them with original documents and so forth. And luckily, in some cases, even before I knew I was writing these books, sometimes I interviewed people just for stories, and sometimes out of personal curiosity, and was able to gather a great deal of material. And even, by the way, even for this book, by this time I started this book, I had some interviews already, but I still found some people, like I found a group of Red Army veterans in Minneapolis who had remembered 41, and even a German soldier had fought in 41. I found living in Queens, New York, a woman who, when I interviewed her 3 years ago, was 103, who had been a secretary to General Sikorski, the Polish prime minister. By the way, when I wrote the book, I wanted to make sure if she was, frankly, I didn't know how to ask if she's still around to get her a copy, and I got in touch with her caretaker, and she said, yes, she'd love to see the book. She's 106. But I mean, of course, this generation is passing, and from the archives, I did not spend so much time in the archives myself because that takes an incredible amount of time. But when I started first researching, particularly the German invasion and the battle for Moscow, which I did a much more detailed study of it earlier, I got to know, for instance, a guy the editor of the archival material, who was getting the newly declassified documents. And he was printing up small volumes of this, very limited circulation, and was kind enough to give me this as it was being released. So it was technically available to anyone, but you had to really know where to look. And thanks to that, I got a lot of documents that were, for instance, the NKVD, of course, the forerunner of the KGB, gathered up from the battlefields the letters and diaries from German soldiers shot on the front. So you often had the accounts of the foot soldiers right up until the day they died. You also had, of course, the records of the censors, who were alarmed to be intercepting letters saying by some Soviet citizens, not just in Ukraine and Belarus and the Baltic states, but even Russia itself, hey, these Germans are coming. Maybe they'll get rid of our regime and Stalin, and things will get better. It wasn't because they knew anything really about Hitler and the Nazis. They just couldn't imagine anybody who'd be worse or more terrifying than Stalin and his regime. And so of course, those were highly classified. I was able to get some of those.
You alluded to this in your talk, but I'd like to know if you could explain it more. By the end of the year, the Germans had met serious resistance in the Battle of Britain. Things weren't going well.
Yeah.
They're meeting resistance now in front of Moscow.
There's, in fact, a first counteroffensive launched from Moscow.
Things are not going well. So why would they declare war on the United States?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that question, I think, as I say, it's a lot of things Hitler did that year appear totally illogical, but within his own internal logic, it made sense and said, if we have Japan, he convinced himself that Japan would tie down the United States in the Pacific, and he was worried about all these supplies going to Britain, especially, and to Russia. At first, he had totally underestimated U.S. military and industrial capacity. He said, oh, the U.S. won't really be able to rearm till 1945. Then his planners kept telling him, no, the U.S. can really get going a lot faster than that. So he thought, well, then it will be diverted against Japan. He tried to see that as the silver lining. But there were so many things. I mean, the other thing that were not logical from any point of view, morality aside, why is 1941, by the way, I think it's the year that also, as we discussed, when the post-war peace and, in fact, the beginnings of the Cold War come into view, it's also the year when the Holocaust is set in full motion. There had been killing of Jews in Poland and in other parts of Eastern Europe, but the really mass killings, which are first with these special killing squads that come in, and just it's what it was described as the Shoah, the Holocaust of the bullets, of just mass executions, and then only later converting to gas chambers, takes place in 41. And there's a diary entry, another interesting diary entry from one of the German generals, Fedor von Bock, who was in charge of the Army Group Center that was driving to Moscow and was running out of supplies, uniforms, ammunition, fuel. And he writes an indignant letter back to headquarters saying, I just learned that there were some trainloads of Jews deposited in our rear lines. They were obviously Jews who were being sent to be murdered in the East. And he's not objecting on ethical or moral grounds. He says, we need those trains for our own supplies. And so even from that point of view, it makes no sense. But yet Hitler had his fixed ideas. And the Holocaust, expansion, the German Empire, the superiority of the supposed superiority of the Aryan race, all that was a bundle. And you did not, logic as the kind of logic you or I would consider natural did not necessarily apply here. But because, again, up till 41, he had managed to defy the odds so incredibly and gotten so far, he was convinced that he could do no wrong. And by the way, we look at Stalin and Hitler. At least Stalin began to learn from some of his mistakes and began to he had terrorized his own officer corps and so forth and killed many of them, but gradually he began to gain some faith in someone like Marshal Zhukov, his famous general. Hitler's response to the first setbacks was to fire some of his best generals and to make himself commander of the army. So Hitler only deepened his mistakes, and Stalin, for all his other faults, did manage to become a little bit more smarter about how to fight Hitler.
Well, I have just one last question here.
A lot of pressure. So as you know, Hitler was a strong ally of Franco and the nationalists in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. As things started to turn against Hitler, or as he met more resistance with Britain and Moscow, or Stalin counterattacked and the United States entered the war, did Hitler ever make any serious overtures to Spain to enter the war formally, to support and kind of pay back for their support during the Spanish Civil War?
Yeah, good question. I don't think he envisaged that Franco and his army could have a huge role in this. It was more a testing ground before World War II for his military. And Franco, as you know, while he was, of course, a fascist and proclaiming his allegiance, was not eager to get too deep into this. He was hedging his bets. But where the Germans did make a push in 41, they were trying to convince Japan to invade the Soviet Union from the east. And that's another one of the stories in my book, which is a fascinating story because it involves also a very well-known Russian spy, Richard Sorge, in Tokyo. And they were trying to convince the Japanese that they were going to take the Western Soviet Union very quickly, so Japan should jump in. And one of the German leaders, I forget which one, whether it was a general or it was Molotov, suggested, well, you can march in from the east and our armies can meet. Oh yeah, that's a short way from Japan through Siberia in the winter. And by the way, one of the reasons why Stalin could withdraw his forces eventually from the Far East in 1941, because he was afraid that Japan might attack. And as German forces were getting closer to Moscow, he wanted to withdraw those forces, but he was afraid to, because Richard Sorge, his spy in Tokyo, found out that Japanese troops were being issued in Manchuria were being issued tropical shorts in the summer. That meant they were not going to be marching that fall and winter into Siberia. They were going to Southeast Asia. And that freed them up, and then these what were called Siberian troops, although they were not all Siberian, but just deployed in Siberia, helped turn the tide in the battle for Moscow. So there were these links, but Spain, I think, was more on the periphery of it.
We'll have to end there. I appreciate everybody coming here, but help me thank Andrew Nagorski for being here.
Thank you.
Well done.